The wind howled through the dry, cracked earth of Blue Ridge, sweeping dust across the settlement, like the restless ghosts of the past. The sun was setting behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows over the rough-hewn wooden buildings of the town. In the center of it all stood a woman, her hands bound, her hair matted with sweat and dust. Her name was Eliza Westbrook, and she was about to be branded for a crime she didn't commit. The crowd gathered in silence, each face hardened by the cruelty of the land. Some with eyes filled with judgment, others with the hunger of a people who had long since lost their sense of mercy. Eliza's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, her heart racing like the hooves of the horses that had once carried her to safety, only to betray her now. She had been accused of witchcraft, a whispered accusation that had spread like wildfire through the dirt roads and candle-lit homes of the town. A woman alone, a widow, with too many questions hanging over her like a dark cloud. But the truth was far simpler than that. She had been a healer, a woman who had saved lives with her herbs and knowledge of the land. She had loved a man once, a man whose death in the war had left her heartbroken and adrift. But when the townsfolk had fallen sick, when their crops had failed, when the land itself had seemed to turn against them, they turned on her, desperate for a scapegoat. Eliza's hands trembled as she stood before the sheriff, her face set in a mask of quiet defiance. The man at the front of the crowd, a rancher named Colton Hargrove, stepped forward, the sound of his boots scraping against the dusty ground, sending a shiver down her spine. Colton had been a friend once, someone she could trust. But now he was just another stranger, in a town that had forgotten how to forgive. The sheriff raised the branding iron, the red-hot metal glowing like a devil's promise. The crowd leaned forward, anticipation thick in the air. But it wasn't the crowd that Eliza feared. It was the man in front of her, the man who had once promised to protect her, the man who had stood by her when everyone else had turned away. Colton Hargrove. Eliza's voice cracked, barely a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "Don't," she pleaded. "Please don't." Colton's eyes were hard, his jaw clenched. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. If he did, he knew he would be lost. He raised the iron, the air thick with the stench of burning flesh. The crowd waited, breathless. But then a child's voice rang out from the crowd. "Don't hurt her!" The words came from a little girl, no older than 5, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She was standing at the edge of the crowd, her small arms outstretched, as if to shield Eliza from the injustice of it all. The girl's voice was soft, but there was something in it, something pure and unbroken, that made the crowd pause. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still, and in that moment, something shifted in Colton. He hesitated, the branding iron hovering just inches from Eliza's skin. His heart hammered in his chest, his thoughts a swirl of guilt and anger. He had promised to protect her, to keep her safe. But here they were, in front of all these people, and he had become the very thing he had once despised. With a final, painful breath, Colton lowered the iron. The crowd murmured in disbelief. "Eliza Westbrook," the sheriff spat, his voice laced with venom, "you've got a mark upon you. No amount of prayers or pleas can change that." But Colton, his shoulders heavy with shame, took a step back. He could no longer be the one to damn her. And that was when Eliza, her hands trembling but resolute, spoke the words that would change everything. "Take it off slowly," she said. Colton's heart stopped for a moment. He looked at her, really looked at her, eyes meeting hers for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun. And in those eyes, he saw something that made him shudder, a quiet, unbroken strength. Colton's hand, still holding the branding iron, trembled ever so slightly as he looked at Eliza. The heat from the metal still clung to the air between them, a reminder of the violence that had nearly been done. His fingers loosened their grip, and the iron clattered to the ground, the sound echoing through the silence of the town square. The crowd's breath caught, like a single body holding its collective breath. Eliza stepped forward, her chains rattling with the movement. She was no longer the meek woman they had all seen bound by fear. There was something different in her now, a fire that had smoldered quietly beneath the surface, a quiet rebellion that was finally making its way into the open. "I said," she repeated, her voice steady but laced with a quiet anger. "Take it off slowly." She lifted her chin, eyes hardening as she stared down the sheriff and the townspeople who had condemned her. She had been a healer, a woman who had cared for them when they were too proud or too foolish to seek the right help. Now they wanted her to pay with her flesh for a crime she hadn't committed. The irony stung, and it was this irony that had burned her more than any brand ever could. Colton's boots kicked up dust as he stepped forward, though his eyes stayed trained on the ground beneath them. He had never seen her like this. There was something raw in her, something fierce that he hadn't noticed before. Perhaps because he had been too blinded by his own shame to truly see her. His voice was barely a whisper as he spoke. "Eliza, don't," she interrupted, her hand raised in a gesture that stopped him in his tracks. "Don't make this about us. This is about me, about what's been taken from me, and what's about to be reclaimed." The words hung between them like the scent of rain before a storm. There was no mercy in her voice, no plea for forgiveness. There was only the quiet certainty of a woman who had reached the end of her rope and was finally prepared to break free. Colton's breath caught in his chest. He could still hear her voice from their shared nights at the fire, the way it had once been so full of hope, full of love. He had been the one to abandon her then, turning his back when she needed him most. Now his hands were the ones that had almost marked her. His eyes flickered to the small crowd that had gathered, their faces hardened with expectation. The townsfolk were waiting for him to do what they had come for, what they had demanded of him, since the first rumors of Eliza's witchcraft had spread through the hills. But Colton was torn. He wasn't just a rancher or a man with blood on his hands from wars fought long ago. He was also a man who had made a vow to his dead wife that he would never harm another innocent soul. But here he stood, in the very town he had built his life, watching a woman he had once loved be torn apart by injustice. And then through the silence came the softest sound, a low snort, a horse's breath. At first, Colton didn't notice it, too lost in the weight of the moment. But when the snort came again, he turned to see a horse, a dark stallion, its coat gleaming with the last light of day, standing at the edge of the crowd. It wasn't one of the rancher's horses, nor was it a horse familiar to the townsfolk. It was the wild stallion that had once roamed the hills near Eliza's cabin, the one that had never been tamed by anyone. And it wasn't alone. Beside the stallion was a small, wiry dog. The dog had once been Eliza's companion, a stray that had appeared on her doorstep years ago, and who had never left her side. The dog's fur was matted, but its eyes were bright with a fierce loyalty that made the air seem to crackle with tension. Colton's heart gave a jolt as the dog moved forward, its eyes locked on Eliza, as if it could sense the injustice done to her. The dog's fur stood on end as it moved closer, its teeth bared in a low growl. The crowd parted slightly, as if uncertain whether to approach or retreat from the unexpected arrival. Colton felt the weight of their eyes on him, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if he could bear the pressure. Eliza, however, took a step toward the horse and dog, her eyes softening as she reached out a hand, a gesture of quiet power that both animals understood. She touched the stallion's neck, then bent down to pat the dog's head, her fingers brushing the matted fur. "I promised you once," she whispered to the animals, her voice so low that only they could hear it, "that I would survive. And I will, no matter what they do." The crowd fell into a stunned silence, the tension between them thick and suffocating. It was as if something invisible had snapped in the air, and everyone could feel the shift. The dog moved toward the front of the crowd, growling at the people who dared to judge. But it wasn't the animals that spoke for Eliza. It was her. Her defiance, small and quiet, but unyielding. Colton stepped forward, his eyes never leaving her. "What are you asking of me, Eliza?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. In those few seconds, Colton saw something in her, a strength he had never noticed before. It was the same strength he had seen in the wild stallion, in the dog, in the woman who had once been broken by love, but was now whole in her own right. "I'm asking you to stop this," she said softly, "and to remember who you once were." The words hit Colton like a shot to the chest. He hadn't been that man in a long time. The man who had once fought for what was right. The man who had fought beside her when they had nothing but each other. But now, standing here in front of the woman who had given him everything, he had no choice but to remember. He turned back to the sheriff. "I can't be part of this." The sheriff's eyes burned with fury, but it was Colton's voice, steady and unwavering, that made him falter. "Let her go," Colton said. The crowd waited, the world holding its breath. The sheriff stood motionless, his fingers still clutching the handle of the branding iron. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, on all of them, like the heat of the midday sun on an empty field. The crowd had gone eerily quiet. Some eyes darted from Colton to Eliza, unsure of which direction the wind would blow. Others were already turning their gaze toward the dust-streaked streets, anticipating a swift end to this disturbing spectacle. But there was no swift end. Eliza's gaze never left the sheriff. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her, judging, condemning, but it was nothing new. She had borne their accusations long enough to know their cruelty. Her hands, once trembling, now hung loose at her sides, the bonds no longer cutting into her skin. The ropes, the branding, the shame, they were all meaningless now. The real wound, the one she had carried for too long, had been laid bare, and now it was time to reclaim what was hers. "You'll not touch me with that iron," Eliza said, her voice quiet but firm. "And you'll not touch this town again with your injustice." The sheriff's eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't move. He knew better than to challenge her defiance outright. He'd seen too many men try to break her, only to leave with their heads hung low. But he wasn't the only one who could sense the turning of the tide. The murmur of the crowd had changed, like the soft rumbling of thunder before a storm. It wasn't fear or hate that vibrated in the air now. It was doubt. Doubt about the righteousness of their cause. Doubt about what they'd allowed to happen under their noses for so long. Beside him, the rancher, the man who had once sworn to protect Eliza, now stood motionless. Colton Hargrove had been a pillar of Blue Ridge, his hands calloused from years of hard work and his heart hardened by years of loss. But it was something in his chest, something he hadn't expected to find, that made him stay rooted in place now. He could hear his own breath, shallow and broken, as his thoughts twisted and turned in a tangled mess. He had loved her once, but that was a lifetime ago. Yet here she was, standing tall, despite the weight of every accusation, every whisper, every betrayal. She had been broken, yes, but now she was whole again. Whole in a way that made Colton question everything he had ever known. A sudden movement from the edge of the crowd caught his eye. It was the old woman who lived in the cabin on the hill, the one who had always spoken in riddles and half-truths, yet whose words carried weight in Blue Ridge. Her eyes, ancient yet clear, locked with Colton's, and for the first time in years, he understood. She didn't speak, didn't have to. Her silence, her gaze, said more than any words ever could. The old woman took a step forward, her gnarled fingers brushing the fabric of her shawl. "She ain't a witch, and neither are any of us," she said, her voice cracking but resolute. The crowd stirred, some glancing nervously at one another. Murmurs spread like wildfire, not of anger, but of uncertainty. The old woman's voice had planted a seed of doubt, and now the truth seemed to crawl its way to the surface. "Eliza is no witch," the woman continued, her voice growing stronger. "She's a healer, and this town wouldn't survive without her. You all know it." The sheriff's hand twitched, but he said nothing. The power in the old woman's words had struck a chord. She had lived through the hard years, the droughts, the winters, and the plagues that had swept through the town. If anyone had seen the truth of Eliza's life, it was her. And then, as if to seal it, a low bark echoed across the square. The dog, Eliza's loyal companion, stepped forward, its hackles raised. The animal's eyes locked with the sheriff's, and for the first time in days, the crowd fell silent in the presence of something pure, something that knew no sin, no judgment, no shame. Colton's heart hammered in his chest. He couldn't bear to watch Eliza suffer any longer. The thought of her being branded, of the life that she had built being ripped apart by these people, it was too much. He had stood by and let it happen, but not anymore. Without another word, Colton moved to Eliza's side, his hand reaching for the ropes that bound her wrists. He hesitated for a heartbeat, but only a heartbeat. The weight of the townspeople's judgment, the sheriff's hardened gaze, it no longer mattered. He pulled the ropes free, the sound of the knots coming undone like a crack in the dam. "Eliza," Colton whispered, his voice breaking the tension between them. "I promised you once I'd protect you. I'm doing it now." Her eyes softened for just a moment, a fleeting glance that held years of shared memories. A time before the war, before the rumors, before the fall of her world. "Eliza," he repeated, louder now, as if to remind himself just as much as her. "You're free!" The rope fell to the ground with a soft thud. The crowd, once so ready to see her punished, now watched in stunned silence. There was no clear victor in this, no neat resolution. But something had shifted in the air, something that could never be undone. Colton Hargrove, the man who had once feared his own shadow, had taken a step toward the light. And Eliza Westbrook, the woman condemned by lies, had taken back what was hers, her voice, her dignity, and her future. But as the crowd slowly began to disperse, the sheriff's gaze never wavered. He was still a man of power, and he wasn't used to being defied. His face, as hard as stone, remained unyielding. But in his eyes, a flicker of doubt had begun to grow. Eliza could feel it, too. The question of who she was, who she had become, had already started to change everything. And though the weight of the town's injustice still clung to her, she knew now that no matter what came next, she would survive. Colton reached out, his hand brushing against her arm. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. For the first time in years, they stood together in the soft, forgiving light of a fading day. No words were needed. The sun had dipped behind the hills, leaving behind only the faintest blush of light across the sky. A soft breeze stirred the dust in the streets, but there was no sense of peace. The air felt heavy with all that had been left unsaid, all the wounds that had yet to heal. Eliza stood beside Colton, her back straight, her hands freed, but still trembling slightly from the aftermath of what had just transpired. The branding iron was gone, the shame of the crowd dissipating like smoke in the wind. But there was something else in the air now, something heavier, a burden that had followed them both into the silence. Colton's gaze lingered on her for a long moment. He could feel the weight of everything they hadn't said to one another. In a way, they had been two strangers for far too long, even though they had once shared the kind of love that felt like it could burn the world down. But that love had been buried with the years of separation, of his guilt, of her solitude. And yet, as they stood here now, with the town still reeling from the turn of events, he couldn't shake the feeling that things had changed. Not just for Eliza, but for him, too. "Eliza," Colton said softly, his voice hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken in years. I don't know if I can make up for what I've done. I left you. He faltered, the words sticking in his throat like rocks. "I promised I wouldn't let anything happen to you, but I did. I failed you." Her eyes never left the horizon, though she could feel his gaze on her, a touch that was both familiar and foreign. She had heard all these words before, from him, from others, and she had learned that words, no matter how sincere, could never heal the deepest wounds. "I don't need your redemption, Colton," Eliza said, her voice low but steady. "What I need is something you can't give me. What I need is to rebuild, to find peace on my own." Colton's heart sank as he heard the finality in her tone. She was right, of course. He couldn't undo the years that had passed, couldn't erase the pain he had caused. But as she spoke, a small voice in him told him that perhaps this was the beginning of something else. Not redemption, but something quieter, something more lasting. "You're right," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "You don't need me to fix what I broke. I can't fix it. But if you'll let me, I'll stand by you, Eliza. Not to save you, not to redeem myself, but because I know what it means to survive this place. I know the land, I know the animals, I know the way of the hills, and I know how hard it is to walk them alone. Her head turned slowly, her eyes meeting his for the first time since they had stood at the center of the square. They were raw, unguarded, as if the years of sorrow, betrayal, and loss had all been laid bare in that single moment. "You never stopped loving me, did you?" Eliza asked quietly, her voice a little hoarse. Colton hesitated. The truth was sitting in his chest like a stone. He couldn't lie, not to her. "No," he admitted. "I never stopped." The silence between them stretched, filled with everything they hadn't said, everything they had buried. Then, without warning, Eliza reached for his hand, her fingers brushing against his rough skin. The touch was tentative, unsure, but it held a kind of promise. Small, fragile, but real. She had come this far alone, had fought for her survival, in ways she had never imagined. But now there was something different in the air, something that whispered of connection, of a path that might wind its way forward through the cracks of the past. "I can't promise you that I'll ever forget what happened," she said softly. "But maybe we can start again. Together. Not as we were, but as we are now." Colton's breath caught, a lump forming in his throat. He had never imagined hearing those words again, not from her, not after everything that had come between them. But here she was, offering him something that was far more valuable than any redemption. She was offering him the chance to walk beside her, not to save her, but to share in the survival of it all. "I'll stay," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll stay, for as long as you'll have me." Eliza's lips curved into a small, weary smile. "For as long as I'll have you," she repeated, her voice softer now, like a thread of trust being woven into the fabric of their shared history. And it wasn't a promise of grand gestures or sweeping changes. It was a quiet understanding, a recognition that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was one they would walk together. There would be no fanfare, no final triumphant battle. There would only be the steady rhythm of survival, day by day, in a world that had forgotten how to be kind. The stars began to twinkle above them as the night crept in, and for the first time in a long while, Eliza felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. It was a small thing, but it was enough. In the distance, the wild stallion grazed in the clearing, its coat gleaming under the soft moonlight. The dog lay at their feet, its eyes half closed in a contented sleep. The wind had died down, and the world felt still, as if the earth itself had exhaled. But there was one more thing to be done. Without speaking, Colton and Eliza walked together toward the small hill overlooking the town. Beneath their feet, the ground was firm, the earth cold with the memory of the day's heat. When they reached the top, Colton paused, his boots scraping against the stones as he turned to Eliza. "Here," he said softly. "This is where it ends." Eliza looked down at the town, the lights flickering from the distant cabins. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger or regret, but in quiet resolution. "No," she said, shaking her head. "This is where it begins." And in that moment, standing together on the hill with the weight of the past finally starting to fade, they knew it to be true. The world had not given them a fresh start, but they had taken one. And in that small crack of defiance, they had found a way forward. The next morning, the town of Blue Ridge was unchanged in many ways. The same dust coated the streets, the same faces greeted the dawn with weary eyes. But there was something different in the air. It wasn't loud or obvious, not a triumph, but a subtle shift, like the first stirrings of dawn breaking a long night. Colton and Eliza woke early, as they had always done, though their mornings now felt different. The silence between them was not awkward, not laden with the heaviness of unspoken words, but rather the quiet comfort of two people who had begun to rebuild something that had once seemed beyond repair. The air was still cool with the remnants of night, the smell of the earth thick in the morning light. The world around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first steps of a new day to unfold. The wind had picked up again, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust, but it didn't feel like a harsh wind anymore. It was a soft, whispering wind, as though the land itself had begun to breathe a little easier. Eliza stood on the porch of the small cabin she had made her home for years, the boards creaking under her boots. She watched Colton as he worked outside, preparing the horses for the day. The dog lay in the dirt beside him, half asleep, as if content simply to exist in this new chapter of their lives. She could see the change in Colton, the way he moved, the way his shoulders had relaxed just slightly. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic moment of reconciliation. There was only this, a quiet, earned peace. Her fingers brushed against the wood railing, rough under her touch, and she looked out over the hills that stretched for miles. The land that had once felt so unforgiving now seemed to hum with a gentle promise, like a silent witness to the battles fought and won, both physical and personal. There was something about it, something that told her that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Colton came up beside her, his boots kicking up dust as he stood next to her, staring out over the land. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. They both knew that the silence between them now held everything they hadn't said before. "You know," Colton said finally, his voice low and almost hesitant, "I never thought I'd be back here. Not after everything." Eliza turned her gaze to him, her eyes soft. "Neither did I," she admitted. "But here we are." The sun had risen higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. It was another ordinary day, but it felt like the start of something more. She didn't know what that something was, not yet, but she knew it was there, beneath the surface, waiting for its moment to emerge. Colton's fingers brushed against her hand, just for a moment, a quiet touch that said more than words ever could. There were no promises between them now, no grand expectations, just the understanding that survival was enough. Survival, and the strength to stand together after everything that had tried to tear them apart. And it was this quiet survival that would shape their future. They didn't need the whole world to understand. They didn't need a crowd to cheer. There was no grand moment of victory, no applause. There was only the earth beneath their feet, the mountains that had watched over them for years, and the steady rhythm of their lives. In the weeks that followed, Eliza began to rebuild, not just her life, but her place in the world. She returned to her work as a healer, though no longer in secret, no longer hiding behind closed doors. The town had started to listen, slowly, to the truth of her life. The accusations that had once hung over her, like a dark cloud, began to fade into the past, replaced by something more hopeful. The land, once barren, began to yield its harvest once more. And Eliza, with her steady hands and quiet strength, helped to heal what had been broken. Colton, too, found his place again, though it wasn't the one he had once imagined. He didn't need to be a hero. He didn't need to save anyone. All he needed to do was be present, to stand beside her, to help where he could, and to accept the quiet power of the land that had shaped them both. The dog, still by their side, had found its place too, lying in the sun at the foot of their porch, content in the simple joys of life. And the wild stallion, though it had never been tamed, would often appear on the hilltop, as if to remind them of the freedom they had fought for, both within and without. At night, when the stars were bright and the air crisp, they would sit together, watching the flickering flames of the fire. There was no need for words then. The fire spoke enough. The crackle of the wood, a soft lullaby, and the night air carried with it the scent of sage and earth. "I guess it was never about the fight," Eliza said one evening, her voice soft as she gazed into the flames. "It was always about what comes after." Colton nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's the getting back up that counts." She smiled, a small, genuine smile, and the walking forward. In the end, there was no grand triumph, no sudden victory to mark the end of their journey. There was only the quiet, steady beat of survival, a survival earned not through grand gestures or heroic acts, but through small acts of defiance, of standing when others would have fallen, and of walking forward into the unknown together. And so in the years that followed, Eliza and Colton lived, not as two people looking for redemption, but as two people who had found a kind of peace in each other and in the land that had once tried to break them. It was enough. Join our journey through the Wild West. Subscribe now for more gripping tales, heartfelt stories, and unforgettable adventures